Okay, so before we go too much further, we want to do a land acknowledgement. Um, and although we are in a digital space today, we want to acknowledge the stolen land we live on in the Portland metro area, where many of us are zooming in from. So this includes the traditional homelands of the Chinook, Cowlitz, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Molalla, Multnomah, Tualatin, Wasco, and many others. We acknowledge the original and continued protectors and caretakers of this land, many of whom were and continue to be persecuted as they protected the land and water for all of us. We commit to making good use of our time together today, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accomplishment. Thanks so much to the Uprise Collective from which this land acknowledgement was drawn. And I believe in the chat, we are dropping a link to that so you have that resource available. Okay, I am going to get us set up for this conversation. First, by sharing with you some of the goals, why we wanted to host this. So shared leadership, as many of you know, because you're probably curious about it, is a non-traditional model, but it is a big topic in our sector and something a lot of nonprofits are exploring and considering. So APANO gets a lot of questions about this because of its 3 co-ED model. And people always want to know how it's going. So here we are. Really happy to have Ali, Amy, and Kim here to share their experiences and learnings with us. So what they're hoping is that what they can share can help inform others in thinking about this model or others like it and how to build them together. So just to be clear, this is the co-ED perspective. So there are a lot of different people involved in this effort, and staff, board, community members, partners, they all might have their own perspectives. And we're eager to dig more deeply into those views as we assess the co-ED model in the next few months. So this is a webinar, so you will have access to the chat, and that's where you want to drop your questions. We're thinking about a half an hour of conversation just among the co-EDs, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. And thank you, Karen, for watching that chat for us. And thank you for continuing to introduce yourselves. There's our other interim co-ED. I see in the chat, Katrina. Nice to see your name there. Okay, I want to turn it over to co-EDs to introduce themselves. And I think we're starting with Amy.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Hey, Natalie, I was wondering if you could just pin the co-EDs and Kathleen, if that's possible. Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. It's a little strange to be talking to a Zoom room without seeing your faces, but I'm really glad you're here. My name is Amy Powers. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the co-executive director of programs. As you may or may not know, we've been a team for about a year, just a little over a year. So I'm just so thankful and appreciative of our brilliant team here at APANO. I get to work with amazing community organizers and activists who just bring their whole selves to our work. So I'm just very deeply honored to be in this role alongside Ali and Kim. I'm homegrown from Washington County. Shout out to my brother who's here online. Hi, brother. We grew up in Washington County. We are children of immigrant parents from South Korea. And I bring that because it really, my parents, how we were raised here in Washington County, just really impacted me and shaped me to be the person that I am. I live in the same neighborhood where I grew up, raising my own little family here, and I'm just really excited to be a part of this APANO team and share with you just kind of our learnings from this past year. I've been in nonprofit and really in the service world here in Oregon for the last, I'm going to age myself, a little over 20 years. And I have worked in small nonprofits to big nonprofits and really feel at home with APANO. So I'll pass it to Kim for now. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kim Lapine. I use she, her pronouns. I am the co-executive director of Culture and Communications, where I support our cultural work and community space teams, our communications team, as well as our strategic framework, equity, and organizational culture work. And I also share oversight of human resources with Allie. Sharing a little bit about myself, I'm multiracial and proud of my Chinese heritage that's rooted in what is now known as Taishan, China. I was born and raised in a small rural town in Oregon where I looked forward to spending all the holidays and summers in Stockton, California with our large extended family, where every memory includes someone asking, "Have you ate yet? Are you hungry?" Very fond memories. From there, I've lived in Corvallis for my undergrad at the Oregon coast and have been in Portland for the last 15 years or so. And most of that time, I spent working on the operations and education side at OHSU. And then I moved into the public health sector and nonprofit world a few years before joining APANO, as Amy mentioned a little over a year ago. I want to share a thread throughout those experiences, more my passion and dedication to cultivating systems, processes, and culture that are more equitable and support staff well-being. I am super excited every day to work alongside such an incredible team and co-create the environment that we want that centers our values. And with that, I will hand it over to Allie to round us out.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is great to see a lot of familiar faces and also, or names, not faces, and also a lot of new ones. So thanks for being here. My name is Allie Yee. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the co-executive director of finance, operations, and development at APANO. I'm a newcomer to Oregon. I moved here in 2019. I joined APANO right away, and I was the development and communications director prior to coming into the co-ED role. And before that, I grew up in North Carolina. I'm very attached to the South. I was working in philanthropy in the South previously, and then also was writing for a nonprofit media outlet, writing about voting and voting rights and immigration and lots of big changes happening in that region. And so that's still where I get a lot of inspiration, and it has really made me believe that place-based work is so important because that is where change happens. And so when I moved to Oregon, I was really glad to connect with APANO and a community that I identified with. I identify as Japanese Chinese American, and I'm just really happy to be part of this team and to do all the sexy back office fun stuff and work with this team and get to dive into it with you all. And just as kind of an introduction of our organization, I know a lot of you all know us, but also for those who may be newer to APANO, we're actually two affiliated organizations. We are APANO Communities United Fund, which is our C3 organization, and APANO, which is our C4 organization. And we have a shared mission to unite Asians and Pacific Islanders to build power and develop leaders and advance equity through many different programs, including organizing, advocacy, community development, and cultural work. And so we work across those two areas, and we co-ED across both of those organizations as well.
Great, thank you. I appreciate you all giving a little bit of your journey, sharing a little bit about your journey to APANO. I want to jump in with, I think, just the perfect first question, which is, how did this happen? Why did APANO decide on a 3-person co-ED model?
Yes, so I can jump in on that. Being on staff when we started this journey, this is not the model that we set out to create. I think when we started our transition of our former executive director in 2020, We went into interim co-leadership with Kathleen and Katrina initially as that team, as we were looking to reimagine what an internally facing executive director would look like, working with an empowered kind of shared leadership model with the director team. And through that process, I think we learned a lot more, did not end up finding the right person in the role, and started to look to expanding further what that co-executive director model would look like. Our interim model was 3 co-EDs at that time, and I think it was looking to make that a permanent structure for us. And so I think there's a couple driving themes through that process. So one was a question of basic sustainability. I mean, we were going through this during the pandemic and the multiple crises that layered on during that time. And the one person being at the helm of all of that was very challenging. So sustainability was a big consideration. Another one was our values. You know, we were thinking about how we live our values in our organization, how things like transparency and accountability show up, and that a shared leadership model would facilitate that. And this is something I've reflected on post coming into this role, but being on staff, I think, you know, APANO has always grown very quickly. We've added lots of different programs. And so in my reflection, I also feel like the complexity of where we were and the growth of our organization meant we needed 3 folks. And it has filled 3 plates very quickly with our onboarding. And so I think those were some of the driving forces, but I'm also curious, Kathleen, you were like in the midst of a lot of it too. So if there's anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think that was really it. It was this real curiosity and interest in how to align organizational values with the work that needed to be done in communities. How was shared leadership a way of really leaning into social justice work, really? And I really appreciate you sharing about the values alignment, because I think that is another real motivator. You know, what is the capacity for an organization to embark on this type of model? It's really difficult if it's just like, well, everyone's doing it. Like that's not a great reason, but it comes out of the work we're already doing, right? And you're called to it. And I do think the board did have a little foresight on that. And again, asked me and Katrina to step in that interim co-leadership way. And yeah, continued conversation with board, staff, and community about those questions of sustainability and values alignments. But yeah, that's what I think. I don't know, anything else, Kim or Amy, from your view? Okay. So can you get a little into the details about that, I guess? So what are the aspects of leadership that are shared and how are they shared?
Great question. Thank you, Kathleen. The way that our structure is set up, as we shared in our intros, each of us have our own portions of work that we oversee. There is also some shared. I think that was very intentional, as Ali mentioned, like in the setup of our structure. A big part of that shared leadership and that structure is being able to trust one another, to lead on the areas that we do lead, and to also be able to lean on one another for support. And what that can look like as we go from day to day and things come up, we need to shift capacity. Being able to have those conversations with one another to be able to get that support and coverage, or to provide input or guidance on aspects of the work. Another big tool that helps us in our shared shared leadership is our shared decision making. We have a decision-making matrix that was drafted prior to the 3 of us coming on as a permanent team, which was a big help. That helps us delineate who has decision-making where, and it also cascades across the organization. So decision-making also gets shared down throughout the organization. with using this tool, we are mindful of being transparent around decision making. And the tool that we use to help us with this is also the MOCA model, the manager, owner, consultant, helper, approver model. And some examples of what this could look like in process. I mentioned that Ali and I share human resources along with our manager, Summer, who I believe might be here. Hi, Summer. Where we have decision-making authority over HR, but we include Amy and, for example, sometimes a finance team or a director team in decision-making. So it really depends on the situation. I would also add that where we have shared leadership is sharing our joy, our learning and processing. We do a lot of that together as a team. Whoa. Excuse me. It gets emotional. And what you're seeing is a lot of appreciation for this team.
Yeah, I do think that's a really important point, is that when we're talking about shared leadership, it's not just the 3 people you see on the screen. And that trust building is such an important part of our work together. And those relationships, they can, you know, I always think conflict is a really important part of a relationship and getting through it. So yes, a lot of support at all levels across the organization. Amy or Ali, do you want to add anything to this idea about the sort of details about what's shared in leadership?
I just wanted to jump in that there are some things that are structured, like the job descriptions and the decision making, and then there's a lot of stuff that we're figuring out as a situation arises, and that builds the process, or it identifies the need for clarification around policies. And so I think that I really lean on the trust that we have built together to figure those things out and to have openness around them and to communicate around them.
Yeah, you're going to hear, I think you're going to hear a lot of that language, right? Around trust, around relationships, maybe even the L word, maybe even love, because it's not just that the work we do in community is about love, but the work that keeps us tied to each other as we are in community is about love. So just wanting to name that that is a really powerful component of shared leadership. So we're hearing a little bit about the details about the job descriptions and the tools and the matrices, but can you share with us how it's going and maybe especially one thing that's gone really well?
I'll start us off, but I didn't realize we were only sharing one thing, so I'm going to break the rules and share multiple, because things are going really well, in my opinion and my perspective. First, I'd like to give a big shout out to the hiring committee. Y'all put in a lot of work to form this team. And then Kim, Ali, and I have just taken it from there, right? So from the beginning, I think the 3 of us, we've worked really hard to build positive relationships with one another and as a team. I'm going to be a little cheesy and say, like, teamwork makes the dream work. It really does. I mean, we lean on each other when we need to. We check in often. We check in regularly, so it's consistent, so we know that we can count on each other. And we care really deeply for each other and for our team. And I think 100% that we care really deeply about our organizations. I think we all bring in our strengths, and early on we did do an assessment of what all of our strengths are and compared that, and we really do bring in diversity and strengths, but also we balance each other really well. So I think that's just like such a tribute to the hiring committee as well, so that y'all knew like where it was that we wanted our co-leadership team to look for in our strengths. And I think the hiring committee really had an eye on that. And, you know, the title of our event today is about what it feels and looks like. And it really feels like love, and it really feels about belonging and caring for one another. So really, teamwork makes the dream work.
What about for you, Kim or Allie?
I echo a lot of what Amy has shared. It completely resonates with me. I think the thing that I will add is that we are helpful reminders to one another to take care of ourselves, and we take care of each other. We remind each other to rest and to celebrate the small and big wins. So creating those intentional pauses and not getting caught in the day-to-day. What about you, Allie?
I mean, ditto echo everything, just to not be repetitive. I think the board was also very strategic in making sure we had support coming into this. So there was coaching for us coming in. We've also been able to participate in like shared leadership cohort through AORTA, and I've been part of a co-ED cohort through national capacity. So those kinds of supports into this as well has been really helpful.
You know, that's really great to hear about the other kinds of external supports that you mentioned, like national capacity and AORTA, because I do think that suggests that, you know, the industry is starting to build some infrastructure to support these alternative leadership models. So that's great. So I think you know what the next question is, because there are a lot of things that are going well. Can you share with us some of the challenges? And anyone, I don't know who wants to start, but please jump in.
I'll start us off. You know, I often feel a lot of heaviness in our work, being co-ED of programs. It can be a little overwhelming. It can be stressful. We're trying to change the world. I mean, literally, we're trying to change the world. We're a racial and social justice organization. So it can feel heavy sometimes. So I say that as a challenge, but also as another way to think of the word challenge is like, how can I push myself too, right? So it is such a comfort to know that Allie and Kim are here alongside me. And that I am surrounded by passionate and brilliant coworkers. Our staff and our teams are just such amazing, brilliant, passionate people. And I just feel so grateful to be a part of this team. And I really couldn't do it without the team, really. So yeah, I would just say that, you know, we experience challenges every single day, and I know that we can get through it and also change the systems that our society is in together.
No challenges? Everything's perfect.
I feel like Kim and I often do this where we're like, you, I can jump in. Capacity has filled up fully. So I think that's one that we are always trying to figure out. Another thing that we talk about with Kathleen and others is how we create the container, right? So what is the right role for an executive director and a co-executive director? How are we creating the container for the brilliance of our staff's work, of community to lead? What are the ways that we create that container and do it together? So it's not just one person's idea of a container, but how are we imagining it together, creating it together. I think it is challenging. It's also like exciting. Like that is why I was interested in this. So I think it's very cool, but it's also like trying to figure that out while still doing all of the day-to-day and the things that come up. Juggling those and juggling them together, I think is like an area that we're really always trying to think through.
What I would add, something that we're still learning and navigating is who needs to be looped in where and to what degree. It's not sustainable for all of us, all three of us to be in all spaces, or sometimes for two of us to be in all spaces. But for me personally, my role and work overlaps more with Allie's areas of work, more internally focused. And so I'm less ingrained into the work Amy oversees with programs, but I would like to be. It would be beneficial, but just capacity-wise, that's not realistic. So trying to figure out what level of information do I need, a level of support that I can provide, while also holding everything else as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think even, a sole ED actually might have that same challenge of when do I need to be involved? When do I need to be in that meeting? And so I think there are some challenges that are maybe general to being an ED. And then maybe it gets more complex when you have three, even though I know all your titles suggest there's a clear division. As you've also said, there's places where it's a little blurry. So this feels like a real like learning and experimental time. Yeah. All right. So I guess I want to pick up on something I've heard a couple times, and again, asking if you can be specific and maybe share with us some examples. So this idea of helping create a container, which I hear as a little bit like a little bit like boundaries, but also a little bit like clarity and roles, so that staff and community can lead. Because shared leadership that exists only at the top, there's some value to that. Like it's modeling, right? That's some value. But I think APANO has much more distributed leadership. Like it's across many different areas of the organization. I think I heard earlier reference to an empowered director team, for example. And in this decision-making matrix, I think there are areas where like a team will make a decision, the ED is not involved at all. So can you all share a little bit about what that looks like beyond the co-ED shared model? What shared decision-making, distributed leadership looks like in other parts of the organization?
I can jump in. I mean, I think you've pinpointed one of the key challenges for us as well, right? I think a year in, we're kind of at a point where we have gained our footing, I think, as a team, and figured out various ways that we are able to share leadership between the three of us. And then there's places where it's happening more broadly, and then there's definitely need for more clarification. So like the decision-making matrix could totally use an update. And going back to MOCA, I think there's a lot of like, we have a very consultative culture, I think, with different folks, right? But it's really helpful to be clear when folks are being consulted or if they have decision, if it's a group decision. So I think there's stuff around like programmatic decisions, what funding to go for, how to build budgets, HR decisions when you're hiring folks, who gets to decide. We have like one area is like we always have a hiring committee who puts forth the recommendation for the hire based on that committee. And then that goes to kind of a co-ED HR approval. which I guess technically means the power is like the co-ED has the approval power, but we also are very deferential to the information and the due diligence and the conversation that the hiring committee has had, right? So there's like, but it's very good to be clear in that process who has which level of decision making, and also transparency of why a decision was made or why a recommendation was made. I don't know if that's specific enough. I would say it's still a place we're still very much trying to think through what this looks like beyond. And I think that's also interesting feedback for us, hopefully through an assessment process, to get a sense of where folks are not feeling empowered by this model and where we could change it so that it can distribute the leadership more broadly.
Anything to add, Amy and Kim? So I guess I just want to, and we have a couple minutes, so I'm going to push a little bit more on this. So a lot of what you're talking about is real clarity around decision making and roles. I heard you use the word deferential, which I think is maybe a refreshing word for traditional ED to use, to defer to a different body at the organization. So being really clear about who gets to make a decision and why, and then also transparency if it was not a group's decision to make, being clear about why the decision was made. So I think even if power and decision making isn't distributed everywhere, if there is sort of sole decision making in some spaces, still a commitment to transparency about why and how a decision was made is something I just heard. Great. All right. Well, I think what we'll do is I'm going to ask one more question, and then we are seeing some questions come up in the chat. And so we'll turn that over to audience Q&A after this. But I guess the one question I would love for each of you to answer is advice. What advice would you give to others considering shared leadership at their organizations?
I can start us off. This is a great question, and reflecting on this, I would say lean into discomforts. You're not going to know what you don't know, and being open to learning along the way. Like resisting that urge for it to be perfect, or the expectation that it's going to be perfect right away. And also along with that, create that environment with your teams and with staff. Like make that the norm as much as you can, and lean into that together and have those conversations.
Thanks, Kim. I totally agree and echo that. I'll also add that pace and patience for yourself is really important. Thinking about with the lens that, we're really here to support our teams and the work that we do and centering our community. Sometimes the pace of that work might not feel like the pace that you want to be in. So just, acknowledging that and thinking about that container that Ali had talked about earlier. And patience, really shared leadership and shared decision-making does take time. It takes conversation. It really takes trust, and building trust takes time. So I'd say pace and patience.
Yes, ditto a lot of this. My big thing has been embrace evolution. I think the pandemic, plus I became a parent, plus I became a co-ED in about the last 2 years or so. And so that has all just been letting go of a lot of things I thought I controlled, timelines, for example, and also just organizationally. I've had this feeling that like we are moving through the current shape of the organization where it has the 3 co-executive directors, and given where we are, this makes sense for us. The other thing that I think I would highly advise on is be very explicit about your values and your priorities. I think that is one of the things that has really aligned well through the hiring process that the board led for the permanent team, and in our relationship building and trust building. We have really talked about what our values are coming in, what the priorities are for the organization. And I think we were just very aligned that we support our staff here, that is our top priority as a co-ED team, to support our staff and support, you know, all the community members that they work with and we work with as an organization, and that we need to prioritize that. So I think that level of like core alignment has really served us well when we get into murky or tension-filled. What am I thinking of? There's an adjective for the word tension. Anyway, into tense moments. I think that is something to come back to. You can ground in it and work through things together.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think right now what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Karen, who's been watching the chat, to jump in. And maybe can you share a few of the questions that you're seeing?
Yes. The first question that came in the chat was, what were the internal organizational processes and cultural shifts you had to go through to adopt this new shared leadership model? And how did the staff adapt?
Erin, is there a chance you can drop that in the chat again? Because it'd be helpful to read it again.
Yes, I can put it in the chat, and it's also in our run-up show.
Perfect, thank you.
I can read it again if you'd like.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions about what did an organization need to do to adopt this? Like, what were the structures? What needed to be in place?
I can jump in. Like, actually, like Kathleen, I think you know this better. So if you want to kick us off with any observations from your involvement in the process, I would be very curious. I can jump in from like I was a staff person at the time, so I can share what that experience was like. Which I felt like it was very organic. It was like one step at a time. We did not go from 1 co-ED to 3 in a year even, right? We went from 1 to 2 interim to 3 interim to 3 permanent, and those were all steps. And there are a couple things that felt helpful to me through the process. One is that there was a transition team that was made up of staff and board together. And then we worked with Kathy Neep on the executive director search process as well. I think was part of managing that committee. So they did research on like, what are the pros and cons of co-ED ships and single? And actually, I think I think our takeaway initially was like, they're really hard. Don't do them, I think was the first round of feedback we got. And they shared all of that. They held like lunch and learns for staff. Like I learned what they were thinking through, who they were talking to, what they were learning from folks. We got the decision-making model was shared with us through that process. So I feel like from a culture perspective, it was clear to me like we were stepping towards this, like we need to get here kind of a thing. And that there was this communication and that staff was involved in that committee, and it wasn't just the board figuring out the transition. Those were some of the things that felt key as a staff person.
Yeah, and what I recall is that there were some internal processes that needed clarifying first. And so there was a lot of needing to understand who did what when, and that was the staff as well as the board. So there was some capacity building that happened to just be really clear about what the board does, what the staff does, and then how you can clarify job descriptions so that people understood their roles and responsibilities. So as far as internal organizational processes, that was there, or there was a lot of building on that. And then the culture shifts. So that is something that APANO and many racial and social justice organizations already do well, which is kind of understanding the external culture, right? And what is happening in community and how to be responsive, but also lead in that space, which is actually tricky. And so being responsive and feeling this need and this rightness about community voice and that community organizing was a power, a kind of power. How can an organization be seen as a community, right? How can a staff be seen as a community that itself needed to organize and self-govern? So I think there was a lot of that happened. And then again, engagement with full staff and board, a lot of transparency and clarity around processes, and a lot of shared decision-making. That's also what I remember. Are there any other questions, Karen, you want us to answer?
Yes, this one might be a quick question, but is there an organizational chart that shows this model?
The org chart is not too different, I guess. I think the decision-making matrix actually is where the decision pieces make sense, because your position does not necessarily exactly mean it doesn't fully identify your full scope. So it's basically like 3 of us, and then we each have our teams, and then the 3 of us report to the C3 and the C4 boards. And there are a lot of questions about the board involvement too, but yes, we report to both board chairs. We meet all together about monthly. They run an evaluation process for us individually and with some peer feedback. And I think it is probably more work than managing one executive director.
You kind of answered it a little bit, but I'll ask the question for all of us. How has your board adapted to this new model? Nonprofit structure has historically been 1 person, 1 ED model. How have they adapted? What has been hard for them?
I could share a little bit that I believe would be new for a board of directors taking on this model. In terms of supporting the co-executive director team, not only do both our C4 and C3 board chair meet monthly with the 3 of us, we also each have an individual board member that each of us check in with on a monthly basis as well. So we don't, it takes potentially additional 3 board members' capacity to provide that one-on-one support for each of us.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and just put an exclamation point on that for organizations that are looking at shared leadership model in the co-ED form, multiple co-ED form, is that boards, like one of the main jobs is to support and ensure that an ED has the resources that they need to do their jobs well and to thrive. And so when you do have more than one ED, a board does need to really understand that you have to supervise and support more than one ED. And most boards are volunteer boards. So it is something that a board shouldn't really take on lightly without having a sense of how they're going to commit to that.
I will move on to the next question unless Amy, you have anything you want to add? How was your experience working with AORTA, and were there other things in hindsight that you would have incorporated into the process?
Ooh, I'll take that question. AORTA is amazing. Highly recommend our partners over at AORTA. We were very fortunate to be part of their first cohort in regards to what shared leadership. So AORTA had a process for different organizations across the country to apply to be a part of this shared leadership cohort. And it really was about coaching and peer coaching. So all sorts of different organizations, like I said, across the country. And we met on a regular basis. And then we also met in pods. So in smaller groups. And it really was about coaching and how we, just like this conversation, like how we figure things out. How do we learn and grow? How do we evolve, share power, and center community and social justice? So it was a really cool experience to be part of the first cohort, and AORTA will most likely do it again. I think they'll take this year to debrief and get feedback around the process. But it was a time commitment. We had to commit to the coaching sessions. We had to meet as a cohort on a regular basis. And like I mentioned, meet in smaller pods as well. So it was definitely a commitment.
Thanks, Amy. Totally agree with that. And I can speak to the second half of that question, which is what in hindsight, what would you have incorporated into the process? So Amy and I were the two that were able to participate in that. Allie was participating in the National Capacity Opportunity. And so to be mindful of each other's time, we intentionally developed it that way, but included Allie into the one-on-one coaching sessions with our AORTA coach. We had all the best intentions to continue to carve out time to focus on our learnings and implementing what we learned after the cohort ended. And we've been able to do that some, but again, it comes back to managing capacity. And so I think in hindsight, as we are still getting our footing, being able to carve out more intentional time to integrate those learnings and creating the space that it takes to process and build upon those learnings together.
Cool. Thank you, Kim. The next question we have is, how do you balance the power dynamics in this shared leadership model? How do the intersections of your work play out?
I can jump in on this one. It's a big question, so I'll do my best with the 1 minute we have. But power dynamics, so many different ways you could go with that one. I would say there's a lot of respect, I think, that we have for each other's like knowledge that we bring and past experience and perspective, as well as the relationships that we have supervising our teams and working with folks on different things. I think transparency is always helpful, right? Like to be in a place of seeking to understand each other, of where things are coming from, or what kind of conversations are being had, or what is being considered. You know, it's a 3-person team, right? So I would say we've done consensus decisions this first year fully. And that's not necessarily we always started there, but we got there so far. But it's also a 3-person team. And I think there was some consideration that there might not be consensus. And if there's a 3-person team, there might be a vote. but this is also like, this is the evolution and the development of it. We haven't encountered that experience yet. And I think we've done a good job in terms of negotiating, understanding, and that takes time. I will say that takes time, and that can be hard to fit into a busy schedule, but you have to slow it down in order to do that. Because if you jump to conclusions on things or make assumptions or drive forward without a base level of mutual understanding, it's hard. Or if you do, you got to like step back and unpack it. So I think that's for like the internal. I also am always like the power balance of the co-ED team and the rest of the organization. Like it's still hierarchical. It is still a co-ED team that sits on top of the rest of the org chart, right? And so that speaks to the earlier conversation about how we distribute decision-making and leadership even more broadly. And I think that is the big question. I think for us, we are really trying to lean into transparency and have accountability and open channels of feedback, and consider like peer evaluations as part of our, co-ED evaluations and whatnot. So there's different aspects of it, and the intersections of our work. Probably not going to go into it too much, but there's a lot of different areas, and there are some areas that we do all together, but just looking at time, I'll pause.
Amy or Kim, anything to add on that one? Okay. Karen, thanks so much for watching the chat and for bringing those questions for us. I guess that's another detail that I wanted to kind of reinforce is, so again, if you're talking about shared leadership, you are talking about structures that do enable decision making and give role clarity. And then it's also how will you make the decision? And so this kind of goes back to an earlier question about what was in place at the culture, and APANO had a pretty good familiarity with FISTA 5, consensus-based decision-making in multiple spaces. And so that is another thing to be really clear about, like how will you and in what spaces will you strive for consensus versus much more directive decision-making. So just a detail there. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Ali, who is going to close this out.
Ali, I think you're on
You're
mute.
on mute.
Thank you. Not the first time I've done a Zoom webinar before. Thank you everyone for being here. And please stay in touch. That's our email addresses. If you want to reach out to us, if you want to get our emails, you can certainly sign up there. And then I think someone is going to drop these in the chat as well if folks need them there. I'm also going to ask to please support our journey. This is our first year with the co-executive director team. We're really excited to continue to build in the second year and see where we go and see where this model goes. Our work is always super exciting and dynamic. And so if you all are able to support us this month, we are doing a lot of talking about our work and asking for support in API Heritage Month. And then speaking of that, we have our Voices of Change annual event coming up this Saturday. We are actually sold out of tickets for the in-person event, but KBOO Radio is partnering with us to live stream. So if you want to tune in to hear speakers, we're going to have Beaverton counselor Nadia Hassan speak with us. We're going to have performances from Portland Tyco and other folks. And so please do tune in, and we hope to see some of y'all there this weekend. All right. Any other final thoughts or thank yous from the group? Otherwise, we can wrap.
No, just thanks to everyone. Yeah. All the participants, interpreters, tech staff, everyone who attended. Thanks so much.